Thousands of years before the birth of Jesus Christ, there was a man named Abram. We think of him as Abraham, but God changed his name later in life. Originally it was Abram, and he was living in Ur of the Chaldees. And God spoke to him and said, Abram, I want you to leave the place of your birth, the place of your family was raised, and I want you to travel to a land that I will show you. And the Bible says that Abram headed out not knowing where he went. Now Abram's brother had passed away, and his son, Abram's nephew, Lot, was still alive on his own, and Abram took him under his wing and allowed him to come as well. So they headed out on their journey. They came into the land that was known as Canaan, and both of them were extremely prosperous in flocks and herds. The Bible says Abram was extremely wealthy in gold and silver and servants and so on. And it got to the point where Abram's cattle and Lot's cattle were so numerous that there was interference between the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot. And they were feuding. They were fighting over pasture land. They were fighting over wells and so on. And Abram called Lot to him and said, it isn't right for us as brethren to be fighting together. I think we need to depart one from another. So he said, I want you to decide. You decide which way you want to go. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. You go ahead and choose. And Lot looked, and he looked the one way, and the land was beautiful for herdsmen. It was pasture land. It was well watered everywhere. It was meadows, and it was rolling land. It was ideal. And the other one, not so much so. It was rocky and barren. So Lot said, I'll go this way to the good land. And he headed off with his flocks and his herds and his servants and so on. Left Abram. Now, Abram had to have felt a little bit discouraged. He had to have thought and said, this was my vision. This was my calling. I allowed Lot to participate with me, and yet he's picked the good part, and I'm left with this. God knew how Abram felt, and God appeared to Abram, and he spoke to him. And he said, Abram, I want you to look to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west, including the land where Lot just went. As far as you can see, and everywhere your foot sets foot on, is going to be your land to possess. I'm going to give it all to you one day. And he said, I want you to go out tonight and look up into the heavens. Stare into the heavens. Your eyes get used to the darkness, and you see the myriad of millions and millions of stars. I want you to go out to the seaside and look at the sand along the shore. If you can number the grains of sand or the stars in heaven, you'll be able to number your descendants because they're going to be that numerous. And then he said, and I also want you to know that in you are all the nations of the earth going to be blessed. So God gave him a threefold promise in kind of consolation, if you like. Time went along, and Lot moved into Sodom. People were extremely wicked in Sodom, but Lot felt comfortable there, and his wife and family, and they made home. Well, there came a time when the king of Elam decided to attack Sodom. He gathered some other kings with him. They went in, and they completely overran Sodom, and they took all the plunder, all the animals of stock, and they took Lot and his family and all that he had. Abram heard about it, and he armed 318 of his servants and went out and defeated the king of Elam and recovered everything and restored Lot to his position in Sodom, and all his flocks and herds and everything he had were restored again. Time went on, and God was so disturbed about the wickedness of Sodom, he deemed that he would have to destroy it. So he went to Sodom, and he was going to destroy Sodom. He sent angels who spoke to Lot and said, we're going to destroy this land. We want you to come out and protect you before it's destroyed. Well, Lot went to his married daughters and their son-in-laws, and they weren't interested in leaving. They wanted to stay. Lot's wife wanted to stay. But Lot was adamant, and he left Sodom and Gomorrah with his wife and his two daughters. But his wife's heart was really in Sodom. She looked back, and she was destroyed. God destroyed Sodom, and Lot ended up fleeing to the mountains and living in a cave with his two daughters. So here you had Abram and Lot, extremely prosperous. And Lot picks the best. He should have deferred to Abram. It was Abram's vision, but he didn't. And ultimately, in the end, Abram continued to prosper, continued to grow, continued to increase in flocks and herds and servants and wealth, and Lot ended up with nothing. You know, there's something about us that just seems to create dispute. We get into disputes so often, and it's important how we handle disputes. We see it within families. We see it in real estate. But often when there's a estate to be settled, and there's a will to be probated, and then the heirs begin fighting. They want to make sure that each one gets their share at the expense of the other. I've seen it where we listed a home and a brother and sister. Neither one was allowed in the home without the other one for fear they'd steal a scarf or a sweater that belonged to the parent. Seen kids end up in court, not speaking to each other, families, over something that was going to be contested in court over an inheritance. We battle and we fight one with another. We see neighbors fighting. I spoke to the bylaw officer, one of them in St. Catharines, and he said, you'd be amazed, my job all day long is to try and follow up on disputes from one neighbor to another. And he said, you know the funny thing, Wayne? He said, I'll go to one neighbor who's complaining that another neighbor's shed's too close to the lot line, but their shed's right on the lot line. He said, I can't do anything about them because nobody lodged the complaint, but I enforce it on the other party. We want to demand our rights at the expense of someone else. We see it, and Paul saw it in the church. Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians, and he saw them going to court one against another. He said, why do you not rather suffer wrong than go to court with your brother? He couldn't understand it, but they were determined to enforce their rights. The Bible says, in terms of dispute and dispute resolution, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. The old adage, I'm third, God's first, my neighbor's second, and I'm third. And if we would maintain that mentality, then when we get into a situation where a dispute could arise, we can, if possible, defer to the other person and maintain relationship rather than demand our rights. The house I live in now, I purchased in 1986, so I've been there a long time. When I moved in, the next door neighbor had already been there for a number of years. He was the first person on the circle, and he was there since 1974, I believe it was. I was putting an addition on my house, and I wanted the driveway to extend out from the garage. Well, because it's on a circle, it would mean that it would cut in front of the neighbor's property. It wouldn't actually infringe on his actual property. It was city property, but it would seem to cut the corner of his property. And I thought I shouldn't do this without talking to him first. So I talked to the neighbor and I asked him if he was okay with that. And he said, no, I'm not. I don't want you to be in front of my property. Well, he'd done the same thing in his property. And I mentioned that to him. I said, well, you did the same thing in your corner. And he said, yeah, but I was here first. So I know I could have called the city and got consent because it was over the city property, and I could have had the driveway the way I wanted it, but it would have poisoned my relationship with my neighbor moving forward for years ahead. So I called in the landscapers, we redrew the plans, we redesigned the driveway, designed the walkways and so on, and I did the driveway so that it wouldn't cut the corner of the neighbor's property. Sometime later I'm building a fence. There had been an old chain link fence that was kind of falling down. It was a neighbor's fence. And I was putting in a solid wood fence, and because there was this chain link fence, I wanted to know if the neighbor was all right with me removing it or whether he wanted the two fences there. It was his fence, the chain link. And I wanted to make sure he was comfortable with the solid wood fence. Well, he wasn't. He said, the problem is it's going to block the sun shining in my kitchen window. So I decided I could cut the fence, step it down there, and not interfere with the sunshine. And hopefully he'd be all right with that, which he was. So I modified the driveway, I modified the fence, and I think I had a good relationship with my neighbor. He was kind of a crusty individual, but you know, he'd come over and we'd sit on the front porch and have a Coke and chat. One time I'd bought a used Corvette, standard shift, and I found out he loved Corvettes. And I said to him, do you know how to drive a standard? Well, yeah, I think so. I gave him the keys and said, why don't you take it for a spin? So what a character for him. He drove around the neighborhood and I saw him whipping by the street one time and another, having a time of his life. We had a good relationship. 3 or 4 years ago, he died. I ended up buying his house from the estate. Now I can pave the whole front yard if I want. I can build a fence, whatever the bylaw will allow. But the important thing is that right up until the time he passed away, I had a good relationship with my neighbor. And it's important that we maintain these kind of things. Now, the interesting thing is I bought his house, I put an addition there, and I ripped up the driveway, and I wanted to redo the driveway, and I wanted it back the way it was before, where it cut the corner of the neighbor's property. I spoke to that neighbor. I said, "You mind if I put it back where it was?" Well, he did mind. He didn't want it back that way again. So I re-engineered the plan, and I shaped the driveway. It's awkward to get in and out, but you can get in and out. But the point is that I was able to modify my plans and come up with a plan that my neighbors were comfortable with, and it meant, hopefully for years ahead, I'd have a good relationship with my neighbor. And you can't always do it, but as much as possible, when you come into a conflict with family, with friends, with neighbors, with coworkers, find a way that you can resolve the dispute rather than having a dispute. The Bible says, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but each in lowliness of mind esteem other better than themselves." God first, neighbor second, I'm third. And God is no man's debtor. The Bible says, "The liberal soul shall be made fat." Abraham deferred to Lot and ended up with wealth while Lot sat in a cave. I struck a deal with my neighbor that he was comfortable with. I own the property. God will look after you. You maintain a right relationship with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family. Try as much as possible to not enter into dispute, and God will bless you. Thanks so much for sharing this time. I'll talk to you again next week.